a record of the empire that spent what it had not yet seen. Towers rose before the money existed. Stone by stone, ledger by ledger, the empire advanced across its fertile valleys and wind-shaped coasts. Those who walked beneath its banners believed they were destined for a wealth that would never dim. They spoke of abundance as though it was inscribed into the very soil. They believed tomorrow would always arrive with more gold than the day before. Yet what they could not know then, but history later uncovered, was that the failure had already begun. It started with a promise spoken in high chambers, where lamplight glowed against maps of territories not yet owned and markets not yet formed. The promise was simple: borrow what the future will provide. The scholars wrote theories to clothe the idea. The merchants smiled as if truth had been confirmed. The rulers signed their names with calm hands, steady, poised, certain. For a time, curiosity carried them. The empire wished to see how far ambition could stretch when anchored to the wealth of days not yet lived, and so began the spark of ambition. Cause. The council sought a path to ascend faster than rivals who grew slowly through soil, iron, and sweat. Effect. They created instruments of credit, letters of obligation traded in quiet halls, claiming ownership over harvest yet unplanted. Unintended consequence. A belief took root. Wealth did not need to be earned, only declared. Citizens watched as new structures emerged, reservoirs that glistened in winter's dim sun, granaries filled beyond reason, dockyards prepared for merchant fleets still being built in distant forests. The empire thrived in numbers written on parchment, so compelling that few questioned their substance. And yet, in the depths of record rooms where ink dried slowly, I found lines that made me pause when I read them centuries later. We have discovered a way to pay for what we have not yet done. Even then, the foundation began to rot. The treasury, emboldened by promises that multiplied faster than the harvest, expanded its reach. It demanded new mines in the northern granite ranges. It purchased grain from across the narrow sea. It hired entire districts of laborers to work on roads wide enough for armies and caravans. Cause. Prosperity became expectation, not aspiration. Effect. The empire extended credit to merchants, to fishermen, to builders, telling each that their success was inevitable. Unintended consequence. A generation forgot the weight of uncertainty. In the great port, square sails of foreign ships leaned against the wind spices, and timber exchanged hands under the cries of gulls. Lamps burned long into the night with merchants tallying figures so vast they no longer spoke of coin, but of seasons, of lifetimes, of inherited obligations. The empire admired itself. I admit, even as I examine its fall, there is something in this era that stirs a reluctant respect within me. Such confidence is rare in history, to believe not only in the present, but in the unbuilt years ahead. This is an audacity that reshaped continents. Yet my admiration is tempered by what followed. For while the walls grew taller, I sense within the documents a message never fully inked, only implied. They built faster than truth could travel. Internal reflection, rise. I have seen this pattern woven through centuries, and I wonder at how ambition always seeks to outrun consequence. As expansion strained the coffers, a whisper began. It said, if the treasury lacks enough coin, then let the coin require less silver. The rulers, needing more to lend, agreed. Cause. The treasury required additional currency to sustain expansion. Effect. The metal within each coin was reduced while its face value remained unchanged. Unintended consequence. Prices rose in markets before the council understood why. In dimly lit taverns, shepherds and tanners spoke of coins that felt lighter in the hand. Traders glanced at scales with narrowed eyes. Bakers raised the cost of bread before the mint acknowledged what it had done. For a moment, the room forgot to breathe. Admiration faded into unease. The first doubt was not loud. It was a stillness in the grain markets, a hesitation in the merchants counting bulk salt from the southern plains. Some sensed it, though they dared not speak it aloud. But what no one realized was that the empire was already changing shape. Debt was no longer a tool, it was becoming the master. The financial rot was slow, quiet, nearly polite in its spread. not through markets first, but through trust. Credit, once honored, became questioned. The letters of obligation that merchants traded like currency now required reassurance. Signatures needed witnesses. Contracts demanded seals once considered excessive. This was the first shadow of suspicion. And across the empire, signs emerged in places only the observant would notice. In the mountain passes, caravans carried less each season, though the ledgers claimed otherwise. Along the inland river, boatmen said the waters felt lower, though the charts disagreed. In the assembly chambers, the windows remained closed, even in the warmth of spring, as if the council feared that outside air might expose the truth. Such details matter. They are not dramatic, yet history is often written in such whispers, not in declarations. Within the empire's own time, these changes felt like mere adjustments. But in the timeline within my mind, centuries later, I know the moment the structure shifted. What they could not know then, but history later uncovered, was that the failure had already begun. Those words haunt any reader wise enough to recognize themselves in the pattern. Any empire built like this feels painfully familiar. It started with a single phrase from a minister of state, recorded in a ledger now brittle with age. Why should we wait for what we can simply promise? That was the moment the foundation began to rot. Unease became a harder edge. The empire's growth no longer felt natural. It was maintained, managed, defended. When a merchant defaulted on a shipment, the treasury assured the public that the loss was temporary. When a distant province refused to pay its seasonal tribute, the council declared the delay strategic. A contradiction appeared. The rulers promised stability. Their actions betrayed a fear they refused to name. And so began the fever of illusion, though I will not yet speak of its full ruin that belongs to the next part, when admiration finally breaks and suspicion turns toward shock. For now, Part 1 ends on the threshold, with a nation borrowing not only silver, grain, timber, or labor, but in time itself. The empire did not collapse in a roar. It collapsed in a held breath. The markets still opened each dawn. The lamps still burned in counting rooms. The harbor chains still lifted at sunrise to admit ships bringing grain, timber, and wool. And yet something in the rhythm of daily exchange had shifted, as though time itself had begun to drag a little slower under the weight of expectation. The empire had borrowed tomorrow so often that tomorrow began to resist. People sensed it in small gestures first. Merchants who double-counted scales, officials who licked their lips before speaking, sailors who stared longer than usual at the horizon as if waiting for ships that might not return. Some claimed the wind itself had changed, that it carried a sound like shears closing over a sheet of cloth already cut too thin. Cause? The ruling council feared hesitation more than imbalance. Effect? To protect their promises, they doubled the pace of borrowing. New credit notes flooded the markets, each backed by more future seasons than the last. Unintended consequence. The measure meant to reassure the public became the reason they began to doubt. Merchants were told that the fleet expansion would soon open new trade routes. Farmers were told that irrigation would increase yield beyond all expectation. Builders were told that new estates would rise along the river, shining in the evening sun. But behind the council hall, in a chamber cooled by stone and silence, a smaller truth unfolded. The treasury mint now worked through the night. Coins left the furnaces still warm, thinner than any issued before. For a moment, the record room forgot to breathe. I've read the minutes from those meetings. There were leaders among them who promised calm, who spoke of stability resting on unbreakable foundations. And then they signed orders that contradicted everything they had just said. A strange fever spread, not through the body, but through the ink of the empire's ledgers. It made numbers grow without labor, without ore, without harvest. Wealth began to expand the way frost expands wood, silently, invisibly, until the grain splits. Prices climbed, wages wavered. Credit, once granted for a single season, now extended across the lives of children not yet born. And still the council declared, "There is nothing to fear. We control the debt. We command our fate." But the more they spoke, the less certain they sounded. Caravans arrived lighter, their guards fewer. Ships took longer to return and carried more rumors than goods. The miners in the granite north sent word that veins of ore were thinning faster than predicted, and though the treasury denied it, the council purchased foreign metals at night, loading them into the mint under tar coverings, as though secrecy could stabilize a currency. In marketplace taverns, conversations changed. No one spoke openly against the empire. There was still pride, still memory of greatness, but the tone shifted to narrower questions. Why does bread rise faster than grain can grow? Why does coin feel like hollow promise? Why does the council say we grow stronger while our hands grow tired? The empire had become a mirror that reflected what people wished to see, but glass once cracked never lies. It began with a refusal. An auction of government debt instruments was held in the capital. Inside a hall illuminated by tall windows and guarded columns, investors from distant ports attended, their robes carrying the scent of foreign winds. For years, they purchased these notes with confidence. They had grown wealthy on the empire's promises, but that day, bidders lifted their markers slowly. Then, in a silence that carried the weight of centuries, hands began to lower. The first loan tranche failed to sell, and in that moment, the empire's masks fell to the floor. Cause: the buyers no longer trusted the empire's ability to repay. Effect: the treasury halted trade, sending riders in all directions to maintain order. Unintended consequence: the panic created the very instability it sought to prevent. Internal reflection fracture. I have watched many realms reach this moment, the instant when belief ceases before power does. It is always quiet, and it is always irreversible. The council convened until the lamps died of oil, debating resolutions, raising voices in chambers once reserved for measured speech. Outside, a crowd formed, not furious, not violent, only waiting. A waiting crowd holds more danger than a shouting one. Rumors traveled like dry leaves across stone streets. The treasury has no gold. The granaries are pledged 3 harvests ahead. The mint cuts the silver with foreign alloy. But what no one realized was that the failed auction was not the beginning of the crisis. It was merely the moment when illusion and reality finally shook hands. For months, if not years, the empire had survived not on wealth, but on the belief in wealth. When belief cracked, debt turned from servant to executioner. The empire had borrowed tomorrow so many times that tomorrow had finally refused to answer. For a moment, the capital forgot to breathe. Even the harbor gulls were quiet. To those living in the era, the failed auction felt sudden. But from where I stand, centuries beyond their horizon, I know what they could not see then, but history later uncovered, was that the collapse had begun long before the hall fell silent. The parasite had been feeding for years inside trust itself. Debt, once a promise of future strength, had become a silent consumption of present vital organs. Trade slowed, grain shipments stalled, contracts previously traded like coin now required collateral that few possessed. Letters of credit had to be escorted by armed guards. In the inland valleys, harvest yields dropped. In the salt plains, workers abandoned their posts. On the mountain roads, caravans traveled in groups twice their former size, carrying less than half the usual load. Winter came early that year, or perhaps it only felt early because fear lengthens every shadow. When fear rises, some seek safety, others seek advantage. And in every empire that nears its final descent, opportunists surface like silt in troubled currents. Cause: the council made desperate promises of recovery, offering interest rates beyond reason. Effect: speculators purchased debt solely to resell it, inflating values that no longer connected to any field, mine, or fleet. Unintended consequence: wealth transformed into a game detached from land or labor. In counting houses, traders no longer asked about ore shipments or harvest conditions. They asked only for new promissory notes, stamped with the seal of a government that no longer governed its own weight. Some grew rich in months, others lost everything in a single night. Gambling and investment became indistinguishable. The harbor tavern served wine imported on credit for men who paid in credit while discussing fortunes that existed only in letters stored inside vaults that held no coin. Contracts became scripture. Numbers became gods. Hints began to surface in the ledgers, a repeating pattern of debt renewal disguised as repayment, a chain of obligations in which one lender was secretly the borrower of another, a treasury that purchased its own debt through intermediaries not yet fully understood by the public. But it will return, and when it returns, it will explain everything. The council addressed the public with unwavering serenity. We have planned for these conditions. Stability is assured. Yet at that very moment, they ordered the mint to issue emergency coinage and sent emissaries across the sea to plead for grain. They promised certainty while digging for escape, and the people saw. They always do, even before they admit it. Suspicion had become shock, and shock now drifted toward silence, the kind of silence in which entire worlds change shape. The empire still lived, it still traded, it still recorded every debt in careful ink. But those records had begun to feel like burial rites. There comes a moment in every decline when people stop asking what happened and begin asking how long it has been happening. That moment arrived quietly. The harbor chains lifted each dawn, but fewer ships entered. The grain houses opened their doors, but more shelves were empty than full. The counting rooms still echoed with the sound of tablets pressed to parchment, but the reverberation carried through air that felt abandoned. The empire had entered its final chapter, though no bell announced it. Cause: trust no longer bound the empire's obligations. Effect: credit ceased to function, and markets became ritual rather than exchange. Unintended consequence: silence spread faster than news, deeper than debt, heavier than loss. People did not riot. They did not storm the council hall or burn the ledgers. They simply withdrew from belief. And when belief retreats, no army can secure an empire's worth. The taverns did not fill. The merchant stalls did not open. The caravans did not depart. A stillness settled across streets once crowded with the mathematics of ambition. For a moment, the empire forgot to breathe. It was not the roads, nor the granaries, nor the distant mines that brought the empire to its knees. It was this. The treasury had begun buying its own debt through shadow accounts, renewing notes with coin that existed only as record, not metal. A circle of promises disguised as payment, a serpent that did not consume its tail, but its heart. This mechanism, buried in ledgers written by careful scribes, meant that the empire had not been borrowing from the future anymore. It had been borrowing from nothing. The moment this truth came to light, even the illusion recoiled and refused to continue. Internal reflection, final. Across centuries, I have traced this pattern. An empire rarely starves from lack of wealth, but from lack of truth. The first to leave were the caravans, not with goods, but with knowledge. Scholars, mathematicians, and scribes took with them the records they could carry, not for profit, but for memory. They did not wish to see the story rewritten into something comfortable. Then came the merchants. They secured what little they had left and vanished into valleys untouched by debt. The council did not chase them. They were too busy searching for a way to reconstruct faith from splinters. They learned that prosperity had not been stolen by enemies. It had been spent quietly, elegantly, recklessly, in the belief that time could be purchased, that tomorrow was a currency, that debt was a shadow and not a blade. They learned that time, once spent, cannot be borrowed back. Picture the empire now, the counting tables empty, the scales unmoved, the ledgers curled at their edges by cold evening air. No shouts, no markets, only rooms that once calculated the future, now gathering dust in the silence of an unmoving world. History never warns the living, it simply waits. Years later, long after the empire dissolved into fractured provinces and distant recollections, travelers found a fragment of parchment sealed in a copper tube protected from moisture and flame. The script, though worn, remained legible. We believed that because we could borrow, we would always return what was owed. We were wrong. The debt was never silver. The debt was time. And so the empire's wealth did not survive. Only its lesson did. If stories like this still matter to you, you already know where the next one will be waiting.